front house. So you can just see why people are so irritated by this.
All right, Ollie Wright, good to talk to you. Opportunity to blow off some steam there, apart from anything else. More coming up on Pienaar and Friends.
Across the UK, on DAB, online and on your smart speaker. This is Times Radio, the voice of the Times.
It's 6 o'clock. I'm John Pienaar. Welcome to Pienaar and Friends. Tonight, that is Tim Montgomerie and Kevin Schofield. And you, I'm happy to say, we're going to be streaming live on YouTube if you want to watch as well as listen, and as well, I hope, as joining in. Send me a text, send me a tweet, and we can talk after the news with James Kitchen.
Thank you, John. Good evening. Donald Trump has accused the UN of funding an assault on Western countries by facilitating illegal immigration. He also renewed his feud with the Mayor of London, claiming the city wants to go to Sharia law. A spokesman for Sir Sadiq Khan has called the comments bigoted. The former UK ambassador to the UN, Sir Jeremy Greenstock, told Times Radio the US president had misunderstood his audience.
This is the United Nations. This is not a MAGA audience of American citizens, and I'm not sure that he was really getting across to them with the opportunity he had to make some firm proposals for finding peace in Ukraine, ending the conflict over Palestine, dealing with Iran in a negotiated way rather than with weaponry. So I was disappointed at the lack of detail to follow up his professed great wish for peace.
Sir Ed Davey claims Trump's America is the blueprint for any government led by Nigel Farage. He's told the Liberal Democrat conference Reform's surge in the polls has created a battle for Britain's future. He challenged activists in Bournemouth to beat the Tories at the next election and set his sights on government too.
Every day, Labour is looking more and more like continuity Sunak. And yet our country is still crying out for change. And as every day goes by, it gets clearer. The two old parties can't deliver that change.
Nigel Farage claims Sir Ed Davey's obsessed with him and would be happy to pay for a psychiatrist. The Home Office is seeking to deport an asylum-seeking hotel resident whose arrest sparked weeks of protests. Hadush Kapadi's been jailed for a year for sexually assaulting a woman and a teenage girl in Epping in Essex. Authorities in Denmark are looking into whether Russia caused Copenhagen Airport to shut down last night. Several large unidentified drones were spotted in the air, although police say there's no indication they intended to cause any harm. The objects disappeared after several hours, and the Danish Prime Minister, Mette Frederiksen, is suspicious.
I cannot deny in any way that it is Russia. We have seen drones over Poland that should not have been there. We have seen activity in Romania. We have seen violations of Estonian airspace. We've seen hacker attacks at European airports over the weekend.
The Prince and Princess of Wales have been to Southport to support the families of the 3 girls murdered in last summer's knife attack. They visited the school attended by Elsie Stankum and were shown around a playground built in memory of Alice Aegir and B.B. King. The Prince praised their remarkable legacies.
This playground is a symbol of how the community have come together to create such a positive place for the pupils of the school, a symbol of remembrance and resilience, a testament that love will always overcome tragedy.
And the legendary cricket umpire and Yorkshireman Dickie Bird has died at the age of 92. The county's cricket club, where he was president, has described him as one of its greatest characters. The former Prime Minister Lord Cameron's paid tribute to his good innings. And for a news bulletin when you want it, search for the Times News Briefing on the Times Radio app.
Across the UK, on DAB, online and on your smart speaker.
John Pienaar on Times Radio Drive with Barclays Corporate Banking.
It is really good to have you with us here on Pienaar and Friends and our good conversation in such very good company, which tonight is Tim Montgomerie, the commentator, now member of Reform UK. Hello, Tim.
Hi, good to be with you.
And always good to have you here. And Kevin Schofield, the political editor at HuffPost UK. Hello, Kevin.
Hello there, John.
And if you want to watch us, you can, because we are on the Times Radio YouTube channel. So look in, listen in, join in, tell us what you're thinking. Send me a text, send me a tweet. Really want to hear what you're thinking. Kevin, what's your thought for the day?
Well, a lot of the political conversation, I think, understandably, in the last couple of weeks, certainly, if not longer, has been about immigration, the rise of reform. Donald Trump, obviously, we'll be talking about him in a little bit, I think. But we've almost taken our eye off the ball, I think, a little bit on the state of the economy. And the OECD had a big report out this morning looking at the global economy and how various countries are doing. And it was bleak again for Britain. The highest rate of inflation of the G7 this year. Economic growth next year, 1%.
Yeah.
Labour, remember, said they'd have the highest rate of growth in the G7 at one point. We're only 2 months out from the budget, and I think the state of the economy, whether Labour succeeds or not in growing the economy and tackling inflation, all these other factors, that more than anything, I think, will decide whether they win the next election. And yet, right now, we don't seem to be talking about it, but come the budget, we certainly will be talking about it, and that could really make or break this government, I think.
Yeah, I mean, look, we'll be going back to the budget again and again before the budget, but we talk about the budget, and that phrase "make or break" comes up again and again, which, when you normally hear that phrase in the context of a political discussion, it's like, would it be good or would it be bad? In the case of the budget, there's no good. It's just about, would it be bad or would it be utterly dreadful?
Yeah.
And there's not even much chance for bad. It's going to be utterly dreadful or beyond utterly dreadful.
Well, yeah, and we were told that the last budget, which raised £40 billion in taxes, that was a once in a Parliament budget. Rachel Reeves wouldn't have to come back and do another one like that. That was to repair the damage caused by the Tories, is what Labour told us. And yet now we're looking at another black hole, anything from 30 up to potentially £50 billion, and she's going to have to fill. And they insist that they're sticking to the pre-election pledge on income tax, VAT, national insurance, which means they're going to have to cobble together some other money-raising wheezes. And as I say, this OECD report again just demonstrates how difficult it's going to be.
And what are they going to look like? I mean, it's the Resolution Foundation, wasn't it, the other day, that recommended a 2p rise in the basic rate of taxation, which would just put a fist through that election pledge.
Yeah.
And you wonder, would she do that? Is it so desperate? Would she try to convince the country there's literally nothing to be done? Fix it now and the good times maybe later on. But the government are sticking to that line too. The last we heard, the Treasury Minister saying that election pledge would also be kept.
Yeah, and I wonder whether the time to do that might have been straight away. Say, look, blame it all on the Tories. It's a lot worse than we thought.
Well, they did try that. They did.
Well, they did. But I mean, in terms of breaking those specific pledges, I think now, were they to do it, then it would be very difficult to try and blame it on the last lot. It would be basically saying we're doing it because we've mucked up, and they probably don't want to do that, even though that would be the easiest way of raising all that money.
Tim, what's your thought for the day?
Well, I'd like to address Donald Trump directly, because I know he's a regular listener of Pienaar Friends.
He's texting all the time on the Signal app.
Mr. President, I'm going to be politically incorrect as you, Mr. President, but you are a big girl's blouse. I've heard there's two Donald Trumps we've heard this afternoon. First of all, we had the Donald Trump that spoke at the United General Assembly and sort of criticised the UN endlessly. And then he sits down with the Secretary General of the UN and starts praising, all the great stuff that the UN is doing. And we do see this a lot with him, don't we? When he's up on the big podium, not looking anyone in the eyes, he can be incredibly critical.
Yes.
But he did it, with Theresa May, or he does it with world leader after world leader. He does it with NATO. When he's actually sat down with it, he's very rarely rude to people's faces. Now, we know there was a very large exception in the Oval Office with President Zelensky, but that was actually partly sort of provoked by J.D. Vance.
Yes.
J.D. Vance started to do it off. It wasn't what Donald Trump had set out to do. And it's I'm trying to sort of turn this sort of observation about a sort of his character into something more philosophical and substantial.
Yes.
But he does do this in a way. So to take his relationship with NATO in a way, just like his relationship with the UN, he's in a way completely opposed to NATO. He says all the sorts of things that you think, well, is he going to leave? Is he going to walk away? But at the same time, no president has probably, in modern times, has done more to strengthen NATO, because he's forced the European countries to spend so much more on our defence. But it was just so stark this afternoon how he couldn't have been more blistering and more Donald Trumpian, sort of his rudeness at the podium. Sits down with the Secretary General, and he is like the sweetness and light.
And you started off by saying,
contradiction.
You shouldn't be so much of a big girl's blouse, and you're right. I'm sure he listens to this program religiously, which means that you're just not going to get the red carpet treatment next time you're in Washington DC. If he hears that,
unlike Putin,
he'll, if there's such a thing as a one-man tariff, it's going to be coming your way, Tim. You burnt the bridge.
So I'll turn up at Washington Dulles Airport next time, and as well as seeing those extraordinary buses, I probably will never get to the buses, will I? I'll be turned away at the checkpoint.
All right. Okay. Look, you were right, Kevin and Tim. Of course, we want to talk about Donald Trump and that speech at the UN just this afternoon. I mean, after the news, we're going to look at it from the American side, but now let's look at it from, as it were, the British and European side, because look, it's difficult to be surprised by anything that Donald Trump says when he gets to the microphone, when he stands on a podium, and yet somehow he still manages to pull off that trick of somehow shocking us. The venom of that speech was, in its way, somewhat extraordinary, wasn't it? I mean, listening back to some of that, it was a pretty wide-ranging speech. It's maybe a polite way of describing a speech, which just rambles and rambles and rambles. He did talk about European immigration.
It's time to end the failed experiment of open borders. You have to end it now. See, I can tell you. I'm really good at this stuff. Your countries are going to hell. In America, we've taken bold action to swiftly shut down uncontrolled migration. Once we started detaining and deporting everyone who crossed the border and removing illegal aliens from the United States, they simply stopped coming. They're not coming anymore. We're getting a lot of credit, but they're not coming anymore.
You're going to hell. That was a message to Europe. I mean, Europe's used to being spoken to in that way by Donald Trump. I wonder if it makes it any easier. And what about Sadiq Khan? I suspect he might have enjoyed hearing this.
And I have to say, I look at London, where you have a terrible mayor, terrible mayor, and it's been so changed. Now they want to go to Sharia law, but you're in a different country. You can't do that. Both the immigration and their suicidal energy ideas will be the death of Western Europe if something is not done immediately. This cannot be sustained.
Well, look, I mean, Donald Trump is not popular in this country, and probably least of all in London, the capital city. And to that extent, maybe Sadiq Khan will say, yeah, you can chuck as much as that at me as you like. But equally, Sharia law, taking over London, I mean, what can you say about that, Tim?
Not very much, really. Can we? We know it's not true. Look, immigration, I'm a Reform supporter. Immigration is a massive problem, and it's true that he's got hold of it across the southern border of the United States in a way that I think even Republicans expected to on a scale of success. So there's always some truth. There's always something relevant to what Donald Trump says. But he just, the nastiness towards Sadiq, I'm no fan of Sadiq Khan, but there's a nastiness, there's a venom there that it leaves a bad taste in the mouth. And he has some substantial point to make. The UN is a ridiculous talking shop. I think nations hide behind the UN when they don't want to intervene in a place like Darfur. They wait for collective action and they say that's international law, which stops them doing anything at all that's useful. The UN is a very corrupt organisation. Its budgets are never properly audited. But we're not talking about UN corruption or whatever now, because he over-eggs the pudding every time, and he makes it personal in a way that doesn't help his case. Yeah,
to talk about European nations doing, because of political correctness, doing absolutely nothing about migration control. I mean, you wouldn't hear that on the platform at, let's say, the Conservative Party conference. I mean, all of the countries of Europe who focus on this are tearing their hair out, looking for ways to address the question of migration. They're not doing absolutely nothing as a consequence of political correctness. I mean, you might almost say it's not very presidential, but I mean, how can one say that in large enough capital letters? I mean, how unpresidential?
Yeah, I mean, he's completely rewritten the rules on what is and isn't presidential. I mean, it is absolutely astonishing. And facts don't really bother him that much. I think Tim's right. There is usually a kernel of truth in what he says, but it's almost lost in all the exaggeration, which he uses time and again to make a point. And I think you hit the nail on the head, John, earlier when you said Sadiq Khan was probably, quite enjoying listening to that, because it's very useful for Sadiq Khan to be able to present himself almost as the anti-Trump. Now, his spokesman was very quick off the mark today, putting out a statement describing his comments on the Sharia law stuff as appalling and bigoted. And also they had a handy little graphic to put out showing that the homicide rate in the US is 7 times higher than London. All this type of stuff, it does Sadiq Khan no harm at all. We might be aghast to hear a US president talk in such terms, even one who's done it repeatedly. But I think as far as the London Mayor is concerned,
all right,
it's welcome.
I want to look at the story from the American side after 6:30. There's more I'd like to get to before we get to the news. Tim Montgomerie's here, Kevin Schofield's here. This is Pienaar and Friends on Times Radio with Barclays Corporate Banking. See you tomorrow clearly with Big Picture Banking from Barclays.
Times Radio on YouTube for the latest videos and interviews.
Times Radio Drive with Barclays Corporate Banking. Expand your business horizons with big picture banking from Barclays. Find out more at barclayscorporate.com/thetimes.
Tim Montgomerie here with me, as is Kevin Schofield. I'm John Pienaar, and you're listening to Pienaar and Friends. I just want to get your thoughts on a story which got a lot of our attention today. Not really strictly political, certainly not with a capital P, maybe not political at all, but a lot of people would have picked up their ears and looked closely at this story. GPs in England, this is the story. They've been told to think again if they see a sick patient more than 3 times and send them away without a diagnosis when the patient says that it's getting worse. Now, it's called Jessie's Rule, named after Jessica Brady. It was about Jess Brady, who went to and made contact with her local family doctor 20 times through pains in her stomach, was sent away at different points, was told, you're too young to have cancer, maybe it's long COVID. Well, she died. Her poor parents campaigned on this. Now they've got this recommendation that a patient who turns up more than 3 times should get a second opinion, should get a reference to another doctor, should get more tests. Something which, an awful lot of us would think, well, of course that should be happening. I spoke to Dr. Rebecca Rosen, who told me why in-person appointments were so important. So many of these appointments were, of course, online.
There are points at which you have to examine somebody. People don't have the language often to describe their lumps or their skin rashes or their itches, and you have to have a look at it. But there are plenty of other times, maybe when you've seen somebody once, you can then follow up remotely. You don't need to look at the lump or the bump again. You can talk to them about it. So it's, again, the Jess's Rule is really important. It's about think and rethink. How do you get the best care for the patient who you're consulting with?
There's a limit to what we can say, I guess, about this sad story that isn't very, very obvious. One observation is that maybe too often the consultations are taking place online when they should be taking place in person. But it does speak to just maybe a deterioration in the trust that used to be so strong between people and their local family doctor. And what can one say about it, Ken?
Yeah, I mean, you're right. I mean, the remote consultations was obviously understandable, brought in during COVID and social distancing, but it seemed to continue way after the pandemic occurred. There was no need for social distancing, and any precautions obviously could always be made. And it just seems perverse almost that we still, for something as important as people's health, a GP surely, all things being equal, should be able to see someone in person to get a proper assessment, a proper feel for what is wrong with them. Now, I'm not a medical expert, but just reading the details of this case it's shocking, really. Now, obviously, hope if anything good was to come of it, then great. Obviously, sadly, too late for Jessica Brady, but just a remarkable story, heartbreaking story. And this idea that she was too young for cancer, that kind of leapt out at me. I didn't know you could be too young for cancer. And it's obviously, as I say, too late for her and her parents, but hopefully it might prevent others experiencing the same
that's
thing.
to do with the perception of her family, her parents, who thought that was one reason, a thought in the mind of doctors. Tim, what can you say about this?
Well, it's very upsetting. You can imagine being someone who keeps going to the doctor. They have this repeated problem, and the pain continues, and just feeling you're not being listened to is an awful thing. I'd just say this as a general thing, is the fact that we don't put it on the pedestal as much as we used to, but the NHS is sort of put on a pedestal, and nurses are wonderful, doctors are wonderful, many of them are, most of them are. But it's like all professions. There are terrible policemen, there are terrible soldiers, there are terrible broadcasters, there are terrible nurses, and there are terrible doctors. Every profession has, and we should be polite, we should be respectful, we should be grateful for our public servants. But some of them aren't always focused on our priorities. Just what Kevin's sharing. Why did physical distancing go on so long after COVID? It wasn't in the interest of the patient. Perhaps it was a little bit, the BMA is not always the most sort of public spirited of professional bodies. Basically, trade unions is what they are. And I think we all do need to be polite, respectful, but I think we do occasionally need to think, I'm not sure this doctor or this nurse or this medical provider is actually giving the service I have paid for and I deserve. And so you can have all these rules and regulations, but we aren't just, I'm sorry to use this word, but we aren't just patients, we are consumers. We have a right to expect a basic standard. And I always remember when I used to talk to my gran, I would say, how did it get on at the hospital, Gran? And she would say, oh, it's such a nice, they're so nice, they're so grateful. I said, yeah, but did they answer your question, Gran? Did they, and it's a generational thing. I think younger generations are more willing to sort of ask the tough questions. But that's the thing, we can all be a little bit more assertive of what we should expect when we go into a surgery. Okay,
well, I just wanted to hear your thoughts on that. Now, I do want to get your views on the latest sort of, rabbit out of the hat from Reform UK, your party, Tim. Yesterday it was about removing hundreds of thousands of legal migrants, people legally settled in this country from abroad, some of them having been here for years, some of them with British-born partners and children, hundreds of thousands. Now, when the policy was set out by Nigel Farage and his team on removing illegal migrants, cross-channel boat crossers, for example, there was a sort of a whiff of, how much of this is back of the fan packet stuff? There were announcements that were then rephrased and rewritten overnight. This policy has been, I suppose, savaged in analysis of what we heard from Reform UK in a way that I can't quite recall happening before, with the kind of that kind of strength of criticism as to what was set out by Nigel Farage and his team. The numbers that were used on the potential savings from removing hundreds of thousands of legally settled migrants, the impacts on services, including, maybe especially, vital services like the health service and the care sector. It sounded as if it had not been thought through. And that is to say nothing of just the mere plain cruelty of breaking up families and telling people now that in a few years' time they face being booted out of the country they have made their home and raised families. Your observations, Kevin?
Yeah, I thought it was an astonishing policy, and not in a good way. I asked an expert at the Migration Observatory at Oxford University, what's your take on it, and they sent back their analysis, and that was the bit that leapt out at me when they said it means that potentially people who have been here for decades, who have made their lives here, who have had children here, could potentially be deported. And that really rocked me, actually. I had to actually get back in touch with them and say, am I reading this right? Surely that can't be the policy. But sure enough, it is the policy. And I just wonder whether it was thought through by Reform in the first place. How they didn't see this coming, I do not know. And just whether they've misread the room a little bit. They've maybe seen that 100,000 marching a couple of weeks ago with Tommy Robinson and thought, that's where the public is now. There's a real anti-immigrant feel, and we can really push the envelope on this one. Let's see how hard we can go. But I just don't think it's very British. I think when people start seeing potential, start to think about their work colleagues, family members, neighbours, friends who have lived in this country for literally decades and have worked and have paid their taxes and have done everything that they're supposed to do, no doubt jumped through all sorts of hoops in order to get indefinite leave to remain, that they could potentially be thrown out of the country. I just don't think that will sit well with the vast majority of British people.
An image that came really very quickly to mind was a picture that's now very familiar from the United States, because we don't in this country have anything like the administrative or physical government machinery to round up hundreds of thousands of people and push them out of the country against their will. In America, they've mobilised a mighty force of federal agencies, the ICE agency, which pulls up at factories, at schools, at people's homes. It slaps people into handcuffs, bungs them into the back of a van and takes them off into detention. We have no such equivalent by a million miles. And to execute a policy like that, if it were ever to be executed, you'd need that kind of mechanism. Tim, I mean, I do want to know what you think.
Yeah. Well, Kevin speculates as to whether this was a policy that came from the march that Tommy Robinson organised and others organised. I don't think that's the case. My theory on this, and I should say I'm a commentator, I'm not a Reform spokesman, so I don't know necessarily exactly what happened, but there was this dinner last Tuesday evening which Boris Johnson attended. There's been reports about it in the press, and I was invited. Unfortunately, for personal reasons, I couldn't go. I wish I had gone because it was an explosive dinner. Boris started, I think, defending his record in front of Marco Rubio, and Andrew Neil of this parish, I think, questioned Boris Johnson about his record, particularly on the Boris wave, this level of immigration that he oversaw. And I think Liz Truss, Lord Michael Dobbs, Nigel Farage, they were at this dinner. And apparently, it's the sort of thing that a drama should be made of, actually. It was apparently a complete demolition of Boris Johnson's time in office. Everyone ganged up on him, and apparently he was a deflated man at the end of it. I think if there is a media origin for this policy, it came from that dinner. And I think it was a big moment for Boris to say, having all these people, Jacob Rees-Mogg was another one, around this table, and it did not go. The evening did not go as he expected. The Boris wave. Jenny Russell has written some very good columns in the Times newspaper about leave to remain. The Boris wave has been part of a big increase in immigration into this country, and not of a temporary potential nature, because people convert their status into leave to remain, and I don't think the British people have really assented to the level of permanent increase in our population that could mean. That is where I think what Reform announced yesterday has some merit. It's educating the public about an increase in the population that they have not assented to. But what you said, Kevin, what you've implied in your question, John, I think there will be a lot of people, if it does mean people who've been here for a long time, who've been made a promise to, essentially, that their leave to remain will be an extended period, perhaps a permanent period. They've made commitments, including potential marriage and children. I think there is something un-British about that, and I think Reform will need to. Let me just say that I think Reform will need to clarify exactly what this policy means over the coming weeks and months. And Reform is. It's a cliche, but Reform is like an aeroplane being built in mid-air at the moment. It's an extraordinary phenomenon that we have a political party emerge from nowhere as potentially the next government. And I think what Reform needs is a more robust internal policy commission process, whereby policies go through more of a board of experts or whatever. There needs to be more scrutiny of the policy. I haven't exactly looked into all the detail of what was announced yesterday, but some of it does make me uncomfortable. And I think I hope lessons will be learnt in how policy is formed in future, because I think when I think if Nigel Farage is confronted with some of these stories, he should have obviously done his homework beforehand, but I don't think that will be what a Reform government would do, and it certainly wouldn't be something I would support.
Okay, so more work, more thought on the fiscal implications of a policy, more work on the administrative implications of a policy, just making it happen.
Population implications, yeah.
Population implications, exactly. And well, the impact on the economy of these as they sit would be incalculable. It would be, in the case of the care sector, irreparable. There are 130,000 vacancies in the care sector now. But then they're talking about kicking out who knows how many care workers because they don't meet the salary threshold, which most of them would not. But I mean, beyond that fiscal question of workability, there's also the moral question. There's the the bit that touches people's souls. Do we want to be in a country that treats human beings like that and their families? And is that about polishing up the policy-making process, or it's about considering who you are?
Well, two things in response to that, John. First of all, what you just said about like care workers being... There were some very good announcements. I'm wholeheartedly back in the announcement yesterday. So one, for example, is a much higher charge for companies that take certain workers in, like high school work. Yes. And the money that is used will be used to train British workers
but you have to
for
find
jobs that
recruits.
we're not...
You need recruits who want to do the jobs.
Of course
and
we do.
at the moment, there are no such recruits available.
I think that's a very contestable remark. I think there are plenty of British people who might do this work. We have...
You mean on much higher salaries?
Well, that's another issue.
We all want her... Let me just put it to you then. We would all like to see care workers paid much better than they are because they're paid generally so dreadfully. And the companies come back with the answer, our margins are absolutely tight as they could possibly be. We could not do that. Now, look, I would like to say, I've got personal family experience of care homes. These people are worth the earth and they're paid very, very little. That should change. Making it change is another matter.
Well, it's one of the big... debates we need to have in this country about how we remunerate people sort of more at the lower end of the income spectrum. Yeah. But the fundamental thing, John, which I think you're skipping over, and I was trying to make the point, and let me finish it, please, is that we do not Britain does not invest in the skills of our workforce. And part of the reason we have to import so many people from abroad is because of that. We haven't done it for a long time. This government actually has some very good policies on construction workers, but it's nowhere near on the scale that we need of training British people to be able to do this sort of work. And the levy that Zia Youssef was proposing yesterday would help potentially that in a considerable way. So there was lots of good policies in this. And look, I have tried to be honest with you tonight about my reservations about some of this policy. You mentioned, well, try to be. And you talked about the morality of
Work
this.
with me here, Tim.
The morality of this policy, though, there is another sign, is that, and this is about democratic assent is a really important principle in a democracy, that the British people should assent to what's happened. And the thing is, we have a moral responsibility to the people already here as well. The people on our welfare, in our welfare system, who haven't got jobs, who've got no hope, who are being written off. And the problem is, so long as we continue this sort of large-scale legal immigration into our country to give big business what it needs, we're going to continue not to address that welfare role. So, yes, we have a moral responsibility to those people who are already here, and I've acknowledged that, but I think we have a responsibility which we have not taken seriously to the British people who aren't fully employed and their skills developed.
All right, we're going to move on. After the news, we're going to be talking to a colleague in the United States, because there's a lot to talk about in the United States and from the United States. Now, it's 6:33. Time for the news with James Kitchen.
Across the UK, on DAB, online and on your smart speaker. This is Times Radio.
Thank you, John. Good evening. Donald Trump has accused the UN of funding an assault on Western countries by facilitating illegal immigration. He also renewed his feud with the Mayor of London, claiming the city wants to go to Sharia law. A spokesman for Sir Sadiq Khan has called the comments bigoted. The Liberal Democrat leader, Sir Ed Davey, said Britain faces a stark choice at the next general election.
Liberal Democrat change true to British values, transforming our economy, our public services and our politics, or Farage's change away from the country we love, change towards Trump's America.
Speaking at the party's conference, he claimed a reform government would privatise the NHS, legalise fracking and roll back gun laws. In response, Nigel Farage claims Sir Ed is obsessed with him and offered to pay for a psychiatrist. The Conservative leader, Kemi Badenoch, says the Lib Dems aren't a serious opposition. The Home Office is seeking to deport an asylum-seeking hotel resident whose arrest sparked weeks of protests. Hadush Kabatu's been jailed for a year for sexually assaulting a woman and a teenage girl in Epping in Essex. A shutdown at Jaguar Land Rover has been extended into next month as it deals with the fallout of a cyber attack. MPs in the West Midlands are urging the government to provide financial support to the car maker's suppliers. And Harold Dickey Bird, one of the most recognisable figures in cricket, is being remembered as a true legend of the game. The Test umpire and president of Yorkshire County Cricket Club has died peacefully at the age of 92. And for a news bulletin when you want it, search for the Times News Briefing on any podcast platform.
This is Times Radio.
On the latest politics, business and sports news of the day.
Times Radio Drive with Barclays Corporate Banking. Change your perspective with big picture banking from Barclays. Find out more at barclayscorporate.com/the-times.
I'm John Pienaar. This is Pienaar and Friends with Kevin Schofield from HuffPost UK with Tim Montgomerie, and Kate's here to tell us about her show after 7. Hello, Kate.
Hi, John. Well, there you go. We're all going to hell, aren't we, apparently, according to Donald Trump. I look forward to that. We will digest what the US president has had to say. There's some striking parallels today. We've had Ed Davey saying that we should, live in Britain as true Brits, embrace the British way and not live in Farage's Trump America, or however he termed it, basically that we don't want to live in this sort of post-truth world. It's been demonstrated perfectly by what we've heard from Donald Trump today. We're also talking about Russia in the show as well, and the suspected incursion by Russia into Denmark. And it's just striking today how European countries are going to hell over our immigration policies, yet Vladimir Putin just sort of gets to remain happily in the background. Many people are saying, why didn't Trump use this opportunity to condemn Vladimir Putin, who we know is not a good, strong friend of his at the moment. He's already lent on that, but perhaps that wasn't shocking enough for Donald Trump. His Secretary of State, by the way, Marco Rubio, spoke to Fox News this afternoon, called the UN a feckless organisation, and claimed Britain and France have recognised a Palestinian state because we've been flooded with foreigners who insist that our governments do those sorts of things. There's so many mistruths around, yet there is probably pretty compelling evidence that a lot of it is believed. And I think that we're coming into that really sticky space, and it is coming into our politics like never before, whether it's Ed Davey making a claim about Nigel Farage and guns, or whether it's Donald Trump talking about immigration being an almighty issue, or that Sharia law is present in London. There's just too much of it. And it's really difficult to see a way through. People are believing it as well.
I'm not necessarily saying you said it wasn't a mistruth, but actually I think Marco Rubio has a point about the level of immigration potentially influencing British policy on Palestine. I think we know Labour lost seats at the last election because of the pro-Gaza vote. a lot of that is driven by Muslim immigration. So it's not irrelevant. It's some of what Donald Trump has said is wrong, but I actually would say that what Marco Rubio said has some truth to it.
Well, he says flooded with foreigners, and obviously foreigners are a lot more than just the Muslim community.
A lot more,
and so you need to think about that, insisting their governments do those sorts of things. I don't know whether you can say the Muslim community insisted that our government recognise the state of Palestine. I understand the cooperation there, the issue of lots of Labour-run constituencies becoming independent-run constituencies instead because of the Gaza issue. It was definitely on the ticket during the election. But it's just everything is supersized, isn't it, and generalised. And it does make you... I guess from Ed Davies' perspective today, was it a case of if you can't beat them, join them? In which case, who's got 70-odd MPs and who's got 4 or 5? So it's just striking what is reaching people at the moment, and how even in this information-rich, heavily sourced world where where facts can be checked really easily, where we have plenty of resource, we have plenty of ways to immediately check facts and understand commentary. It's a really fast-moving world. Why none of this is called out? And I suspect it's because we are addicted to big, bold statements and things that sound like they could be right. Maybe they fit our own personal view without actually understanding whether statistics and facts back that up.
Yes. Yeah. Look,
I'm not deriding everything, John, but I'm just saying, you've had 2 really big examples today, both on the home front and in the United Nations as well.
I mean, the President of the United States rarely sets out a fact or uses a statistic which is not false.
Yeah.
I mean, they're almost invariably completely wrong, and not just mildly wrong, wildly wrong. I mean, I'll give you a very small catalogue. Whether you're talking about the American economy, which apparently is getting the benefit of trillions of dollars worth of investment as a direct consequence of tariffs, which is absurd. I mean, we're talking about tens of billions perhaps coming in over a period in tariffs, which are being paid for by American companies. This is not trillions of dollars into the American economy. Whether we're talking about Ukraine. He said at one point during the UN speech, it wasn't much picked up on, and why would it be? He said 6,000 or 7,000 people have died in the Ukraine war. I mean, multiply that by, a few 100,000, and you'll be getting somewhere.
Well, it probably means a month or a day, but that information goes.
You'd struggle to find any use of that figure.
It's also the
and when
question
we're talking about American investment in the Ukraine war effort, he keeps repeatedly using the figure of $350 billion US. It's half that, and he must know that. And I could give you other examples. He has no regard, whatever else you may think of him. He has no regard for facts. And he has no regard for statistics.
Yeah. Well, he keeps talking about bringing drug prices down by 1,000%.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's not even possible.
It's also whether,
again and again and again
it's also
and again.
whether the United Nations are foolish, or whether Donald Trump should be able to use the platform of the United Nations to speak to make a speech of mistruths. And so then you do have to question the organisation. What is the point if you're going to hear statements from world leaders? If your aim is to agree on resolutions. Why are you entertaining a speech full of mistruths from one of the most important leaders in the world?
Well, if the president turns up and makes a speech, it's his speech to make. There's nothing in the mechanism of the UN to sort of do much about that.
But it just makes a mockery of the whole thing, because he clearly doesn't respect the UN, because perhaps he doesn't respect anyone.
He may have had a point, mightn't he, Kate, when he spoke about the United Nations being pretty dysfunctional. I mean, this is an organisation that was built for World War II, post-World War II. The Security Council was built around the powers after World War II. No account of the world as it is now. Its services don't have funding. It does not have authority. Its operations, if they're not simply incompetent, they are, as Tim mentioned earlier on, there's an awful lot of corruption there. This organisation needs enormous surgery. But as for achieving that, or what a UN after surgery truly looks like, that again is another whole question. And we're looking forward to your show, 7 o'clock, right after this. Now, it is time at 6:43 to welcome our friend from America, George Grell's Washington correspondent. Hello to you, George.
Good afternoon.
It's great to have you here, George. Look, we've been talking the hind legs of a donkey about the President's speech at the UN earlier on. How is that playing where you are? What's going to be the headline there, George?
Well, I think you've got to bear in mind this is one of 3 days in a row where he's given quite meandering speeches, first he did the Charlie Kirk memorial service where he went a bit off script, and whereas Charlie Kirk's widow Erica was talking about forgiving the man accused of murdering her husband, he said, I can't forgive my enemies, and that obviously kind of jarred a bit with what she was saying, and he went off on a tangent, started talking about autism and linking it to paracetamol. So that then followed through to the Monday where he gave the press conference where he was talking about vaccines and paracetamol and how those contributed to ADHD and autism among children, a spike in diagnoses, which again was a pretty remarkable piece of TV. And now, for the third day in a row, we've been treated to the Donald Trump show.
Yeah.
And on this occasion, he talks about everything from the flooring of the UN headquarters in New York. So he's basically a bit peeved that just over 20 years ago he didn't win the contract to do the refurbishment, and he doesn't appreciate the choice of terrazzo flooring. He wanted marble flooring, and so he's still angered by that. So he talks about that. He talks about air conditioning in Europe and how he doesn't believe that countries like France and Spain have enough air conditioning units, and that this isn't the Europe that he knows and loves. So it was an absolute pick and mix of topics today.
It was. I think he spent more time talking about the flooring and the walls at the UN than he did about the war in Ukraine. It was like listening to your boring next door neighbour going on about his builder. But as you said, Donald Trump's speech is simply what it is. I mean, I want to move on from that because we've chewed that one pretty extensively. I'm going to get your thoughts, George, and all of us talk a little bit about the aftermath of the president yesterday stepping into the field of medical science and suggesting that doctors should not prescribe Tylenol, paracetamol as we call it, to women expecting a baby. Other things tonight. It's also Jimmy Kimmel's return night, so maybe have a find time for a word or two on that on Pienaar and Friends with Barclays Corporate Banking. Change your perspective with big picture banking from Barclays.
Of the news with Kate Borsay from 7 p.m. as she brings you tomorrow's Times Today. An exclusive look at the stories making tomorrow's headlines. John Pienaar on Times Radio.
And here with me on Pienaar and Friends, Tim Montgomerie and Kevin Schofield and George Grills, Washington correspondent for the Times. George, can I just go back to you? A lot of waves here on this side of the water about and there too, one presumes, about the president last night making what he called the biggest medical announcement in, I think he said, in the history of America, when he spoke about his advice to American doctors not to prescribe Tylenol or paracetamol, as we call it here, for pregnant women. Well, we've seen the way that's got the debate raging. I mean, how's day two of that story there, George?
Well, and the advice to pregnant women themselves. He told them you've got to tough it out, ideally, if they're experiencing pain. Bear in mind that paracetamol was the kind of is really the recommended by obstetricians and gynecologists, pain reliever for women who are pregnant. So, look, I was struck last night watching it that the American broadcasters cut away. And I'm not sure if that was to do with the fact that they thought it was irresponsible continuing to broadcast this, or if it was to do with the fact that he went on for over an hour. Again, it was pretty freewheeling. And, I was flicking through all the major networks in the US, and eventually I had to rely on the kind of YouTube stream put out by the White House itself, because everyone cut away, because it just went on and on and on.
Really? What are you thinking now, day after?
Yeah, I mean, it is just remarkable, and it's scary, actually, because there will be people who, despite what maybe a lot of us have written and a lot of us have said, that will actually believe it. We'll just think, well, why would I take the risk of taking paracetamol? I will try to tough it out, as Donald Trump has said, and the possible repercussions for that are vast, aren't they? Medically, and also for the health of pregnant women.
I was talking to a GP today, who was saying that she and every GP dealing with an expectant a mother to be, would now feel they had to guide them away from this advice and deal with the anxiety which they expected to come in now in enormous volume.
And there's the fact that he produced no evidence at all, and he admitted he didn't have evidence, but he had a feeling that obviously that's what he's been told that by Robert F. Kennedy Jr., his health secretary, and is just going along with it, and it is just absolutely bizarre. If anything, even more bizarre than his speech at the UN, I think.
But George, it is kind of in keeping with the pattern of, the development of federal health policy.
Yeah, I mean, RFK Jr., who is basically made a career out of, casting doubt on vaccines and pretty established medical science, was his health secretary and was standing right next to him. And, he was able to say, not only are we looking at the links of drugs to diagnoses of autism, a rising number of kids being diagnosed with autism, he said we're also looking at vaccines as well. And it kind of spiraled from talking about paracetamol to talking about the MMR jab and the number of immunizations that children receive. So it wasn't like it was a kind of limited, it was billed initially as this kind of limited, targeted, this is what we think is the reason for autism, and this is the action we're taking. And then it turned into a kind of, a denunciation of variously established scientific truths.
I'm going to change the subject, because when you're talking about developments in the USA, which we are kind of fond of doing, you've got to change the subject because there's always so much to talk about. So I want to ask you first of all, George, this will not in any way involve you straying away from your territory as an independent journalist who does not take sides. Are you watching Jimmy Kimmel tonight?
I have to say I've never watched Jimmy Kimmel live before. I guess maybe today would be a politically charged moment to start. It's interesting that the cancellation of all these, there was a debate initially about whether the cancellation of these late night TV hosts was about their networks pandering to Trump and them not wanting to annoy the White House, or if it was about a long-term trend, which is essentially declining audiences, that these once massive shows in the US are no longer getting as many viewers as they once did. And what triggered it was really the Stephen Colbert debate, and his show got cancelled. But then the interesting thing about Jimmy Kimmel and his remarks in the aftermath of Charlie Kirk's death, where he kind of suggested that the shooter might have had kind of beliefs or been aligned with the MAGA movement, which later basically transpired to be wrong. But, when he got cancelled, what happened was that Brendan Carr, who is a Trump appointment and is basically the head of their equivalent of Ofcom, explicitly called for him to be cancelled because of those remarks. So there was no hiding away from the fact that this was a politically motivated decision. And then Disney obviously faces backlash over that decision. They run the show, and so he's been reinstated.
Yeah, I mean, there's it's worth sort of pulling apart some of the threads here. I mean, Tim, if a TV company takes objection to what, let's say, a comedian on a show says, maybe thinks it's insensitive, maybe thinks it's far too political, for whatever reason, they have the right to sack that person and take that show off the air. That then is a commercial decision by the boss of a network. It gets into a different place when the state, as it were, when the federal government gets in, calling that same shot.
Yeah, I think it's called the FCC, I think, isn't it? The
Federal Communications Commission.
Yeah, I think that was where I think the line was overstepped, was when you had a government body sort of trying to influence what the network wanted to do. Of course, it's muddier than that because there are certain networks that also have regulatory issues, or regulatory preferences that they want from the White House or from the administration. So, there's other ways that the pressure can be more subtle. But of course, it's not, we have this issue here. GB News in Britain is in some tension with Ofcom. Now, the same people who've been complaining about, the way the FCC have interfered in US affairs, quite correctly, actually have been egging Ofcom on in a lot of their battles with GB News. So I think we're at the point, really, where we have so much competition, in our media landscape now. I think these regulators should just basically butt out and let us as consumers basically decide. Unless it's, legally actionable, in contempt of court or something, I think most of us are grown up to know that, when you're watching GB News, you're not necessarily watching the most balanced of, channels. When you're watching a late night comedian, it's late night, it's after the watershed. Let us actually exercise our own judgment in these things.
Yeah, it's because that line was crossed. This looks like something of at least a bit of a defining moment. We've got less than 5 minutes left. As I said, loads to get in. I want to consult you one more story, which I think is remarkable by British standards, like almost everything else going on in Washington. But where the Homeland Security Secretary, George, seems to tell me the background to this. He seems to have been caught on camera accepting money in a bag in exchange for promises of policy favours. The FBI watched it as part of a sting, and then when the presidency changed, the case was dropped, and now the White House is behind the Homeland Security Secretary. Have I got any of that wrong?
That sounds about right. Yeah, it's Tom Homan, and Caroline Levitt was asked about this at her briefing. I guess it was yesterday. It must have been. Time passes quite quickly here, and she kind of dismissed all allegations. I guess in the US they have this slightly different approach where FBI agents can go undercover and just give people bags of cash and basically what would appear a form of entrapment almost from maybe European perspective. And he gladly accepted it. And then obviously the case has been dropped since the FBI has been taken over by Kash Patel, who's a Trump appointee.
Has this story got legs in America?
It's not like Trump has thrown any of his other appointees under the bus so far. I don't see
as a story
to start now.
Is the story going to roll for much longer? Is it part of the flooding of the zone? No, nothing lasts for very long.
I mean, the Witkoff family runs a crypto empire, as does Trump, that is having billions of dollars that is funneled into it. That is, on the scale of questionable practices, I think this is pretty small fry.
Yeah, a bag full of 50,000.
If you're in Team Trump, they will back you to the hilt. It doesn't matter what you've done, pretty much.
Now, this won't happen very often, but I would just like to make a declaration of sympathy for the Liberal Democrat leader, Ed Davey. The poor man, he gave his big speech today, and Agent Trump has completely wiped him out, hasn't he? And we were sort of talking earlier about, what was happening at Sky News and everything. And apparently, they were dutifully, carrying the broadcast. But the worm, this thing that measures, audience engagement was slowly slumping. Switch to Trump. The worm goes up, it's. I just feel, it won't often happen, but I feel a little bit sorry for Ed Davey today.
Perhaps that's why Trump was even more outrageous than normal, because he knew he had to try and top Ed Davey. Have we thought of that?
That was it, wasn't it, George? I mean, I think the cat's out of the bag. Donald Trump was just trying to bump Ed Davey off the front page.
The whole MAGAverse has been avidly following the Lib Dems party.
I mean, you're right. Poor Ed Davey. The thing is, it's part of his pitch. In his sort of his pitch today is to be the repository of anti-Trump sentiment. The people who think the government's not tough enough on Trump and so on I'm here, Ed Davey, the Liberal Democrats. The trouble is he's utterly drowned out by Donald Trump.
Well, one other thing he said in his speech was he had to go at the media for giving Nigel Farage an easy ride, as he described it. Well, I mean, he's going to be really furious with the media now when he finds out that they cut away from his big speech halfway through to go and cover Donald Trump of all people. It's more grist to the mill that maybe the media's got it in for poor old Ed Davey.
It's karma.
Well, we're into party conference season, and so whatever else all of this is, it's very good for trade.
Absolutely.
Is it not? Anyway, it's great to have you with us, Tim Montgomerie. Let's do it again next week. Always a pleasure, Kevin Schofield. And thank you to you for listening. Our producer today was Hugo Chambray. Our technical operator was Isaac Marley. I'm going to be back tomorrow, as always, same time, same channel, same chair, with a great deal to talk about. I have no doubt, not even sure what it's going to be. I just know there's going to be lots of it. And as promised, Kate Borsay is up next, here on Times Radio.
Across the UK, on DAB digital radio, online and on your smart speaker. This is Times Radio.